On the edge of the city of Ypres, the Menin Gate is being renovated. Beyond it, along the Menin Road, lies the Ypres Town Cemetery, where English lords and princes lie alongside ordinary soldiers from the Great War. I'm back in Ypres this weekend. I didn't think I'd return to Flanders for some months, but being a battlefield guide, things can change at the last minute. And yesterday I found myself departing South Yorkshire at an early hour and heading to Ypres to have a weekend here with a ledger group and guide them round the battlefields. And the evening sun is setting over the rooftops of the city of Ypres. I can see the spire of St Martin's Cathedral and the Cloth Hall from the ramparts where I'm standing just in front of the Menin Gate. And we've had a great day on the battlefields, touring some of the well-known sites and some of the lesser-known sites and telling the stories of the Great War, and often hearing people's own connection to that as well. And I've met an unparalleled number of podcast listeners today, which has been a real great experience to do that. It's always great to meet those of you who listen to the podcasts, and I'm always really interested for you to come up and say hello and just have a chat, and it's really great to do that. And I've just finished here at Ypres. The coaches have just pulled away. The last post has been sounded, and the Menin Gate ahead of me is quiet. I can hear blackbirds and the odd chiff-chaff in the trees in the distance. And the top of the ramparts here is quiet and calm, serene, with early summer sun casting long shadows over parts of the Menin Gate and the Indian Memorial that's in front of me now. I can't get to the Menin Gate because it's undergoing a series of renovation. You can hear the bells of the Cloth Hall in the distance there. So you know I'm in Ypres, that familiar sound for those of us who travel here and stand in that main square. It's hard to, at times, imagine what the city of Ypres once looked like. The ruins of an ancient civilization, many people described it as when they came here just after the war. And now we see that phoenix that rose from those ashes and the rebuilt city and the rebuilt spires. And life, more than a century later, has returned, just as it should do, to normality. But I've come here in the quietness of this early summer evening to stand here before the Menin Gate. I'm looking over the black panelling that screened the gate off. There are poppy wreaths from recent last post ceremonies attached to the panelling. It's a good way of displaying the wreaths that people bring here. So many groups come, so many schools come here to remember. The students take part in these acts of remembrance, which perhaps they'll remember always, perhaps inspiring them an interest in the Great War that will live on, just as it inspired me when I first came here all those years ago. You can only hope so. But it's screening off the Menin Gate, and I can see over the panels towards the names inscribed on the memorial. And the process is beginning now to renovate the Menin Gates. We were very lucky to have Sarah Nathaniel on our podcast supporters evening last month to tell us about the project to renovate the gate. It's coming up to a century old. In 2027 will be the centenary of the unveiling of the Menin Gates. And it's a memorial that has intersected two world wars. It commemorates at its very heart the missing of the Ypres salient, those men who were denied by the fortunes of war a known grave, as the memorial states. 55,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers inscribed on the panels, the missing of Ypres. Only part of the story, because others are commemorated just up the road near Passchendaele at Tyne Cot and down in the southern sector of the battlefield at Plugstert. So it's a memorial that commemorates those with no known grave, the missing, one of those terrible aspects of the Great War, the way that the fate of missing soldiers tortured the families of those missing men. What had happened to them? How had they died? Very often there were no witnesses to their death. And with no grave and no witnesses, no clear indication that a man had been killed, how do you ever accept that he died? And for many, they couldn't. They could never accept it. Something that we've covered in previous podcasts, but it's something that I always think of when I come back here to the Menin Gate. But now, as I say, it's undergoing this process of renovation. The memorial is closed, the panels are not accessible, the names can't be seen. And it's necessary, of course it's necessary. This memorial, close to those 100 years, needs repairs. It hit, as we've mentioned, that intersection of both world wars, with standing as it does for the missing, but also a monument that featured in the battles in the early years of World War II. In May 1940, the Moat Bridge was blown by the Royal Engineers. The memorial was damaged. It got hit probably by 20mm flak guns. Who knows what damage was done to it, both in the upper section and the lower section. We can see some visible scars of it on the front of the Menin Gate, but there's probably much more. And it appears that some of that damage was never properly remedied. So it needs work doing to it. But it feels strange standing here now and not being able to walk up to those panels of names, those nameless names, as Sassoon called it, incorrectly in my view, because they stand for so much. The monument, like all of these memorials to the missing, reads like an A to Z of English surnames, British surnames, of Welsh surnames, of Scottish surnames, and weaves through the history of the Empire, now the Commonwealth too. Because there's not just British soldiers on the Menin Gate, there are other nationalities as well. It commemorates that coalition war that we fought to defeat Germany in this part of the Western Front. But it is strange to stand here after so many years of visiting this city and this memorial to not be able to walk up to it. You can walk through it as a passageway, we're going to go through that shortly. And while the work is, of course, as we've said, absolutely necessary, it kind of feels a bit distant. The last post ceremony, to the credit of the Last Post Association and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, whose site this is, continues. We just heard it beneath on the Moat Bridge, on that road that led out of the Menin Gate, out onto the battlefields of the salient, where so many thousands of men marched, often to an uncertain future during those 4 years of the Great War. A passageway to the front line, and the monument marks it forever. It's when you realise, when you come to these places and you think about them, how these memorials exist on so many different levels, have so many different meanings, stand for so many different aspects of the Great War. It's not just a monument that lists the names of the dead. It speaks for so many stories and links us back to those fateful years of the Great War. And I think when I come here, of the veterans that I met under the gate in those early years of coming to the Western Front, of the veterans who I knew had returned here, of the veterans that I knew who had marched through the Menin Gate during those war years, and what it meant to them. A pathway to a very different world, a world of fire and flame, and noise and gas and explosions, a world from which they may never return. But thankfully, most of them did. The ghosts gather here, and I think it's not just the ghosts of the dead. It is the ghosts of those who survived, whose mates are inscribed on these walls. I think the dead links us not just to the fallen, to the families of the fallen. It links us to the survivors who had to live with the memories of the men whose names are on here. Who knows what stories are hidden behind these lists of names? Who knows what agony survivors had to witness as their mates disappeared into the mud, got left behind on battlefields, or were buried in shallow graves, later destroyed by shell fire. And I think it's the power of these memorials that makes us contemplate and think of all these things. But enough of the contemplation for now. We're going to head from here on top of the ramparts in front of the Menin Gate, go down the slope towards the streets that run alongside the ramparts. And mindful of the history of where I stand, the ramparts were the old Vauban fortifications. Beneath them are the tunnels and chambers used by the British Army in the Great War. Near here, the Ypres Times was printed, that trench newspaper made by those men of the Sherwood Foresters. And the dugouts of the tunnelling companies that operated beneath the Bellewaerde Ridge, they too were here. So many units passed through the ruins that surrounded these ramparts, that stood defiant against the German guns and shells, and was the only feature of Ypres that survived the war. But we're going to walk down the ramp now, down to the Menin Gate, and walk through the gate and see what we find as the renovations begin. And this walk will take us as well beyond the Menin Gate, along a bit of the Menin Road, and we'll go and visit the Ypres Town Cemetery to look at some of the stories of the men buried there, and that's where we'll end up. But first, the Menin Gate. Now look up in the sky now, and there's the Swifts. I saw my first Swifts over Thiepval on the Somme this year, and these are my first Swifts in Flanders, flying high, buzzing low over the memorial. The monument, part of the landscape, part of the natural world that surrounds it. Can only be a good thing. But now down to the monument. There's some scaffolding as you come down from the ramparts down to the road level of the Menin Gate. And right by the corner in front of the monument are a couple of pubs, local pubs, with battlefield visitors in them and locals enjoying a beer. The Menin Gate was built on a site where there'd been a pub before the Great War, a pub where the civilians who were still living in Ypres up to 1915 drank in while the battles raged around the city, and a pub that got hit by shell fire and was demolished, and some of the people inside being killed, their bodies not recovered until the monument was eventually built in the post-war world. And I guess it's kind of strange resonance that here are those places where people now enjoy themselves and drink, and once the Menin Gate was part of that more than a century ago. But ahead of me now are the beginnings of the scaffolding that's going to surround the gate. It'll eventually be in some panelling and some covering to protect it while the work begins. And it will take a while, it'll take a couple of years before things go back to as they were, and essentially this grand old lady of Flanders will emerge anew in time for the Great War centenary. And you can hear the noise of the modern world behind me as I walk through here. It's important to understand that these monuments exist in not just the natural world and the landscape of the natural world, but in the modern world too. We need the people of Ypres to accept and understand these memorials in order to see their continuation, their acceptance, and the involvement of people in these acts of remembrance. And they've put some passageways through the Menin Gate, little walkways that are covered over, and I'm going to walk through those now. I expect it'll be quite echoey as we walk through here. I'm taking a familiar route for me on the right-hand side of the monument with the city behind me, heading out towards the Moat Bridge. I know that behind these plastic panels are the panels of the Royal Fusiliers. On there are the three Rachel brothers who were killed on the same day in May 1915, leaving behind their mother in London to deal with the fact that three sons were killed on the same day. 3 telegrams would arrive. 3 young men would disappear into the mud of Flanders, never to be seen again, with no grave, no sepulchre, except their names on this memorial. How would she have dealt with that? Alsjeblieft.
Excuse me.
Alsjeblieft.
Hey, girl.
The bikes have just passed me as I thought of Mrs. Rachel and her 3 sons killed at Bellewaerde. And I'm coming up to the point where normally we'd cross the road. The archway going to the upper part of the monument is to my right, behind these panels. And up there are the Royal Sussex names. Colonel Crispin, killed on his white charger along the Menin Road in October 1914. Lem West from Eastbourne, awarded the military medal as a stretcher bearer at Richbourg, killed when the bunker they took over as a regimental aid post was hit by artillery fire on the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres. So many other stories. And just ahead of me now, on the right, are the panels of Canadian soldiers, including the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. And I'm running my hand along these panels, knowing that just the other side of them is the name of Talbot Mercier Papineau, one of my Great War lodestars who had followed around the Great War battlefields and followed his life for so many years. They feel a long way away, these names. I can't see them, I can't touch them. It feels as if there's a very big space between this plastic panelling and where those names are. Perhaps it's melancholy, but nevertheless there's a degree of sadness that I can't feel and see and touch those names, as I've often done. But they need this work. They need this work to be done. These names need to live on beyond our lifetimes to inspire future generations. And as I emerge from the end of what is essentially a tunnel, come out onto the moat bridge where the two lions are located, I'm back in the world beyond the gate, looking down the moat with the walls of the ramparts to my right and the monument now above me. Piles of scaffolding, piles of fencing, just the start of it. But the start of something good. This isn't a bad thing. It's me reflecting on being distant from this monument for a while. Just as we've been in recent times with memorials like Arras and Chapval, which have also needed renovation. The Menin Gate will emerge, and those quiet, kind acts of remembrance that have taken place beneath these archways, beneath these panels, as families have reached out to connect with a name in a distant past for them, they will happen once more. The world will turn, the last posts will be sounded, and the history of the men who marched through here and the men whose names remain forevermore on this memorial, that will continue. They're not missing, they're here, and today I can't see them, but I know they're there. And there is a comfort in that, not just names, stories and lives, and loves and hopes and fears and everything else. Everything we look for when we look to uncover the stories of those ordinary men in the extraordinary circumstances of the Great War, whether it be here in Flanders or anywhere on the Western Front. And I'm sure we'll return to this memorial, return to the work that's taking place on this memorial again and again over the course of the coming years. But for now we're going to head along the Menin Road and up to Ypres Town Cemetery. I've walked from the Menin Gate along the road over the moat and up to the beginning of the Menin Road and turned off and taken a side road that's walked me past some of the 1920s houses, up along some dark red brick walls and into the neat lawn entrance with its neat hedges that takes me in through the gate at Ypres Town Cemetery. There are 3 cemeteries within the city confines of Ypres: the Rampart Cemetery, the Reservoir Cemetery, and perhaps the lesser visited Town Cemetery, which sits amongst the civilian graves of the citizens, of the past citizens of Ypres over many, many generations, back to, in many cases, before the Great War. There are some very old graves, headstones in this cemetery in the civilian plot. But I've come in through the main Commonwealth entrance now, and the graves are scattered in here. They're not all in one place. And I've walked into the first plot. The weather's changed a bit today. It's been a very sunny day. We've been all over the battlefields with the Ledger Group. And the weather's turned a little bit. The skies are a bit greyer than they were this morning. And there's a light breeze. The birds are in the trees. I've seen swifts darting over the mine craters on the Messines Ridge. There's been blackbirds heralding me as I've walked in through here, and I can hear the cooing of pigeons in the distance there in the trees that surround this cemetery. It's a cemetery that I've been coming to for many years. It's got some very interesting burials in it and some very interesting stories amongst those burials. And as I walk in, the graves immediately on my right are from a scattering of different dates. Men from the gas attack period in April 1915, the Canadian Army Medical Corps personnel, Royal Fusiliers, then some from the later battles of the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. But I know that in the plot that I'm just walking up to now is a group of men who were killed at a key moment in the very first Battle of Ypres. And that moment was the 31st of October 1914, when the Germans pressed hard against the British positions along the Menin Road near to Gellivelt. And the men I'm looking at, some quite senior officers here. Colonel Percival, DSO of the Northumberland Fusiliers. He died that day, aged 43. Major George Paley of the Rifle Brigade. He was 42. Colonel Kerr, DSO, Gordon Highlanders, 47. And Major Chevenot Trench of the Royal Field Artillery, aged 36. And Captain Omany of the Royal Engineers. There's quite a mix of cap badges there, because these are not soldiers engaged in combat with the enemy. These are staff officers, and there was a meeting of staff from several formations in the Hooge Chateau, just along the Menin Road. And they were meeting there to discuss what was happening on the battlefield when shells rudely interrupted their staff meeting, and several senior officers were seriously wounded, and these staff officers were all killed. And what it meant was essentially the entire command and control of that particular part of the battlefield was essentially wiped out in an instant. And today I took my group up to Polygon Wood and was telling them the story of the most senior officer commemorated on the Menin Gate, Brigadier General Fitzclarence VC. He'd won his VC in the Boer War as an Irish Guards officer, gone on to command a battalion of the Irish Guards, and he was a brigade commander in a brigade that included his old Irish Guards battalion on the outbreak of war. And at Polygon Wood on the 11th of November 1914, he led his old battalion into action, a brigadier general leading a battalion into action, and he was killed, and his body was never recovered, and his name is commemorated on the Menin Gate. But his story also ties into these majors and these colonels and these staff captains buried here, because when they were killed and when the senior officers above them were wounded, a message got to Brigadier General Fitzclarence that this had happened, and he realised the significance, the importance, the desperate importance of this. So he appointed himself officer commanding Menin Road. So aside from his own infantry brigade, he took on responsibility for any and every units that he found around him. And it was part of that critical moment, the reaction to that critical moment, the loss of these men, the loss of command and control, that men like Fitzclarence were able to step in and save the day. So it's interesting. And these men, I would guess, I've not ever looked up their Commonwealth War Graves Commission burial records, but I would guess perhaps they were maybe originally buried in the grounds of the Hooge Chateau, or perhaps they were killed there and they were brought back here to Ypres Town Cemetery for burial, which brings me to how this cemetery came into being. Because in the early phase of the war, and it's a good point to start with men killed in October 1914, and I can see ahead of me a row of men that I know are 1914 casualties, buried in what is essentially a collective grave with multiple names on the headstones. In 1914, there were no military cemeteries as such. They decided, in many cases, to bury the dead in already consecrated ground, communal cemeteries or town cemeteries, like this one. And that's how this cemetery came into being. They buried the dead from the battlefield, and in this case, this is a kind of separate officer's plot. I can see a gunner in the Royal Garrison Artillery, Gunner Marchant, at the end of this row. I wonder if he was a signaller who was working alongside them, a gunner signaller. That's quite possible. But this is essentially a kind of a separate officer's plot here. I can see a couple of other officers buried behind them. And that was the practice in the early years of the war. Use existing burial grounds to bury the dead. And then as the war, of course, went on way beyond Christmas, that promise of the war being over by Christmas soon dissipating, the cemeteries grew, the burial sites grew, and the types of burials and the difference in burials, from trench burials to mine crater burials to communal burials to mass graves, all of that changed as well. But this cemetery reflects the early stage of burials through to the haphazard nature of burials in this area. There were medical units close by. Some of these men died of their wounds and they were buried here. Others were killed right out on the battlefields and then brought in here for burial. And we'll see a few of those and talk about a few of those as we walk round. And they're scattered. I'm in a big plot now, surrounded by a high hedge and some pollardy trees. There's a cross of sacrifice at the back of the cemetery, civilian graves all round me. Outside the walls of the Commonwealth plot, there's a stone of remembrance. There are graves over to my left, which I know are from the Second World War, Czech graves, British graves, Royal Canadian Air Force, men who died in the retreat to Dunkirk in 1940, and those who were killed in the liberation of this area in 1944. But it's the Great War graves, of course, that we've come to see here. And scattered throughout the cemetery, amongst the war graves, are war graves of a kind. And these are the graves of Imperial War Graves Commission and Commonwealth War Graves Commission gardeners. They were once scattered throughout the civil plot, but there was a redistribution of graves a few years ago, and a large number of them were moved into this Commonwealth plot. And I'm looking at a row of these gardeners now. Ian Gilliand, Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who died in 1978. Richard Collick, also of the Commission, died in 1986, aged 89. I would guess that he would be a Great War veteran. Thomas Brown, 1951, aged 63. And the names go on. And I know there are several people working on the stories of these Commonwealth gardeners. It's something that I hope to return to. There's a book coming out on the story of the gardeners and what happened to them in that interwar and Second World War period. Fascinating subject. And there are many, many stories, I suspect, behind these headstones. But there's one that I always come to here, one of the Commonwealth gardeners, and I'm standing in front of his grave now. William Billy Dunn, Commonwealth War Graves Commission, died 7th of December 1987, age 88. Served 1st Battalion, the Worcestershire Regiment, 1917 to 1920. Now, on my very first visit to Ypres in 1982 with my school, with my teachers, they took us to St George's Memorial Church in Ypres, that magnificent memorial church that commemorates many thousands of soldiers who fell at Ypres during the First World War, and regiments and units, divisions, all kinds of things. And when we first went in there, we went in through the entrance, opened the big doors, and then sitting just by the entrance as we walked into the church was an elderly gentleman on a chair. And I said good morning to him. And he said good morning back. He said, "Are you British?" I said, "Yes." And we got chatting. And I said, "How come you're here?" And he said, "I'm a retired War Graves Commission gardener, and I'm also a veteran of the Great War. I served here on the Kemmel sector with the Worcestershire Regiment." And that was Billy Dunn. I met him on my very first visit to Ypres in 1982, and he died a few years later. I met him a couple of times subsequently, and I've thought about him a lot over the years. I think the significance of meeting him at that time probably wasn't as apparent to me then as it is now. And I was delighted to find a few years ago a little video clip on YouTube of a school visit like mine to the church in the 1980s where they speak to Billy Dunn. And I'll try and find that to put onto the podcast website. The crisscross paths of the Great War, we often talk about those on this podcast, and there's no doubt when I stand here in front of the grave of Billy Dunn and I think about that time, the right place, the right time, the right moment. I could have met anyone in that church that day, but I met him, and there's a significance to that. I've accepted with the Great War that there is no such thing as coincidence. These people, these stories, these names from the past, they find us, they search us, perhaps to retell those stories. And that's an important part of our remembrance, I think, of the Great War. And I've continued past the war graves plot into the next bit of the military cemetery, and I'm in that collective grave of men from the first Battle of Ypres in 1914. There's a lot of cap badges of different units here that very much symbolise, act like beacons to the story of the red little dead little army that fought in that first Battle of Ypres in 1914, the old Contemptibles as they were known. This was the hour in which that old army of the pre-war world faded away. 56,000 casualties in the first Battle of Ypres, and these are all part of those casualty statistics as I look at the names and the regiments: Guards, Connaught Rangers, Green Howards, Staffordshires. It's very much a story of what was happening further up along the Menin Road. And these men, killed or died of wounds received in the fighting, were brought back here for burial. And it's interesting to see that in a period in the war in which generally officers were buried separately, there is an officer of the Royal Field Artillery buried amongst them, Lieutenant J.W. Brown, who died on the 10th of November 1914, buried in a grave alongside a Guardsman Cannell, who died a few days before. Multiple cap badges on the headstones, good indication that it is a collective grave, and I've walked to the middle of the plot, and there it is, the ultimate confirmation that this is a collective grave, a headstone with just a cross on it. That was done with all collective burials. What's under here? I mean, who knows? A trench dug and the men buried side by side, fragmentary remains from the battlefield, men buried perhaps in linked arms, with arms over shoulders. Who knows? We could romanticise about it, but probably in reality it was a situation where a trench was dug, and as the dead came in, as the men died, they were buried side by side. But that single grave that you see is worth looking out for in the cemeteries. Then you know what type of grave that you're looking at. I'll put a picture of it on the podcast website. A headstone with just a cross, no cap badge, no text, and always in the middle of the row of graves where that collective plot is located. We'll move on to look at some of the others, just across the lawn from me now. I've walked now across to a grave at the end of a row of just a handful of graves of Lieutenant Lord Worsley of the Royal Horse Guards, who died at Zandvoorde on the 30th of October 1914, aged 27. His inscription reads, "He died fighting for God and right and liberty, and such a death is immortality." Worsley's story has always interested me. Lil MacDonald's writings about the Great War, like many of us, I guess, have always greatly influenced me and influenced what I've sought out on this landscape of the Great War over so many decades. And when her 1914 book came out, one of her best, I remember reading her story of Lord Worsley in there. She used quite a few sources for it, including the memoir that was published by his wife, which contains some very sad photographs, melancholic photographs of them standing together on the railway station as he departed for war, the last time that she would ever see him. And he went off as the machine gun officer of the Royal Horse Guards. They had machine guns like the infantry battalions and a machine gun officer in charge of them, and that was him. And he was not the kind of spit and polish officer that you'd expect for a unit like the Royal Horse Guards. After several weeks of active service, he was dishevelled, covered in dirt, had a hefty growth of hair on his face that would have made any sergeant major scream. But it was the realities of living on active service in a campaign like this. But he was a tough soldier, and in the defence of Zandvoorde, a tiny force of these men from the Household Brigade fought off a much bigger German force coming towards them. And in that action, with his machine guns sighted well on the high ground on the edge of the village, laying down murderous fire into the advancing Germans, his position was overrun and he was killed. Now, the looting of the dead is not something to be spoken about lightly or discussed lightly. It is a sad reality of war that when soldiers capture a position and find the dead, they do go through their pockets to see what they've got. Booty, souvenirs, money, who knows what. And the German unit that captured this position, one of the officers saw that this was the body of a dead British lieutenant and turned him over and went through his pockets to get his papers and discovered that he wasn't just a lieutenant in the British Army, he was an English lord. And he ordered that all of his possessions, his rings, his documents should be taken and sent via the Red Cross back to his family. But unfortunately that officer was killed a few days later, and that never happened. And Worsley was posted missing, and his wife had many long years of agony, no doubt, wondering what had happened to him. After the war, the defence of Zandvoorde by the Royal Horse Guards and the Household Brigade was commemorated by a memorial, and Lady Worsley was the one that instigated that. She possibly thought there was a way to perhaps commemorate her husband, even if he didn't have a known grave. But during the work to construct it, by a miracle, they found his body, and his remains were moved here to the Ypres Town Cemetery to be buried in the grave that I'm standing in front of now. The memorial was constructed. It stands as a tall column. It lists all the names of the men of the different horse guards and household units, lifeguards, so on, that died in that first Battle of Ypres. There's many famous names on there. I've just today been to the Aristocrat Cemetery. Alexis Baron de Gunsberg, who's buried in there, his commanding officer, whose incredible inscription on his grave, "Life is a city of crooked streets, death the marketplace where all men meet." And there at the memorial at Zandvoorde, those stories of those men of that brigade, they meet with that monument and the list of names that's there, which includes, of course, Lord Worsley. So it's an incredible story. And I'm thinking now of that photograph of him and his wife on the station, not really knowing what to say, not really knowing what to do. A last touch of the hand, a wave goodbye, and that was it. Replicated so often, sadly, so many thousands and thousands of times in the Great War. So we'll move from an English lord into the next bit of the cemetery to look at the grave of a member of the British royal family. In the far corner of this plot there's a little flight of steps that takes you up into the next level of the cemetery. I can see many of the very ornate, much older civilian graves ahead of me on the gravel path. And going up these few steps, there's a tall pollardy tree to my left, and a grave, an individual grave, surrounded by a curbstone. And this is the grave of that member of the British royal family, Lieutenant Prince Maurice of Battenberg, KCVO, King's Royal Rifle Corps, 27th of October 1914, aged 23. And again, when I was with my group today, we went up onto the Bruinzeider Ridge this morning. As you come up onto what was in 1914 the Bruinzeider Crossroads on the road to Passchendaele, that was part of the defensive line, and the young prince was killed there in the fighting in the first Battle of Ypres. And there's now a blue plaque just off the roundabout commemorating him on that spot. And these blue plaques are becoming commonplace in this area, and I'm quite liking them actually, because it's a good way of commemorating some of these important stories and the individuals connected to them. There's one outside Hoog as well, and hopefully there might be some more in due course. But this grave was the most senior British royal to have died in the Great War. I think probably the most senior royal to have died in either World War. He was a grandson of Queen Victoria, and he'd entered the King's Royal Rifle Corps as a regular soldier before the war, and was serving with them on the outbreak of the war, and came across as part of the British Expeditionary Force, killed in the first Battle of Ypres. Now, during the war, many people came to visit this grave. Many members of other European royal families, I think the King of the Belgians came here, for example, and prime ministers. I'm pretty sure Lloyd George or Asquith, or maybe even both, came here during the war. King George V visited the grave, the Prince of Wales visited the grave, and over the years since, many other royals have come here. The late Queen came here on many, many occasions, particularly on significant anniversaries of the 11th of November. She came to visit this grave. But there's an interesting story, and we spoke to Roger, his book about the aftermath of the Great War, and in that he talks about the cemeteries. And Prince Maurice of Battenberg, Roger Stewart this is, who we interviewed on the podcast, a few weeks ago, in fact probably a couple of months ago now, and again I had the pleasure of seeing him today in Hoog. It's always great to be out on the battlefields like this to bump into people. But anyway, this grave caused a lot of controversy actually, because the royal family wanted him to be repatriated, to be buried back in the UK. I don't know where, perhaps Westminster Abbey, I'm not sure, but they wanted him home. And this was at a point in which it had already been decided that the graves would remain in theatre of operations in situ. They would not be repatriated, the remains of soldiers who'd been killed in this war. The royal family thought that they could somehow contravene that, step over that. I don't think this was a mean decision on their part. It was an honest, natural decision. Many families at the time were not happy about the lack of repatriation of graves and were very vocal about that. But the royal family was persuaded this was the wrong decision to make. If the royals were seen to be able to bring their family home, how would that make the rest of the nation feel, who either couldn't bring them home because they were missing, or would never have the money to be able to repatriate the dead back home to wherever they came from. And I picked up a while ago a set of photographs taken by an Imperial War Graves Commission photographer, and one of them was a picture of Prince Maurice's grave as it was in the end of the war, just quite a simple wooden cross. This wasn't a massively ornate grave, and what it was replaced with was a standard Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone. That idea of uniformity in death, of being able to step into a cemetery and not tell the difference between a man from the back streets of Manchester or an English lord or a prince. It's a founding principle of the War Graves Commission, and seen very vividly here. And the royal family did the right thing and not pressed for him to be brought home, for him to remain here. And I think perhaps for the soldiers themselves, we can't speak for them of course, but what would they prefer? To rest for all eternity alongside the comrades they'd fought by, or to come home? Maybe they want both. But here they rest eternal, and here they remain immortal. They will stand for as much as all time ever is, looking out across these battlefields. So I'm going to leave the Prince behind and walk along another row of early war casualties. There's a lot of 1914 dates on the graves as I walk down this gravel path to the next bit of the cemetery. The interesting thing about Ypres Town Cemetery, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are many civil graves in here. Some of them quite recent, others much, much older. And some of the graves, particularly up towards the Menin Road, they are graves that were here during the war, and they have battle scars on them. They have indents from shrapnel and high explosive that dropped into this cemetery. The Germans were not deliberately targeting a cemetery, particularly at that stage, that it mainly had civilian graves in it, hardly any war graves, military graves, and why would they target them anyway? But these were random shells that were being fired at Ypres and dropped short and landed here in the cemetery. And that's how these graves were damaged. And incredibly, at the end of the war, quite a lot of the original graves were still standing and are still here today, more than a century later. I recently picked up a stereoscopic photograph taken in the cemetery showing some of those graves as they were at the end of the war or in early 1919. The first time I've seen a photograph of that. And as I walk down here, these are kind of typical civilian graves. A lot of them have the ceramic photographs of the people on them. I often wonder whether they would approve of the photographs that we used. There are quite a few Belgian war graves in here as well, so Belgian soldiers that were killed on different parts of the Belgian battlefields of the Great War, largely the Ypres front to the north of Ypres, who were killed up there, and their families had them brought back for burial in the family grave here at Ypres. You see that all over Belgium. Everywhere I've ever travelled in Belgium, you find these war graves, family graves with a soldier buried among them. The dead of Belgium, much like the dead of France, are scattered way beyond the actual battlefields. And as I come, and I've done this walk quite a lot with groups when I've come here, I find it a fascinating place to visit Ypres Town Cemetery because of all this, that you're seeing the stories of the soldiers, but you're also reaching out and touching the past. And I'm coming into that part of the cemetery where you can begin to see battle damage on the graves. I'm looking at a column now which has got some kind of mount, probably for a cross on the top of it. It's got a huge section of it knocked out, impact marks from shrapnel, and then alongside it another column with a cross on with very visible shrapnel marks on the top of the column to the Corpetier family. These have all got notices on at the moment. I think graves remain static or remain in place for 99 years, I think it is, in Belgium. Perhaps some of our Belgian listeners can tell us more about this in the podcast notes on the website, and make a comment on there if you know more about this. But I believe it's something like 99 years, and then the graves can be reallocated, the headstone or the monument torn down and the ground reallocated for new burials. And I'm sad to think that some of these might disappear. So do come in here when you can to come and see this, in case they do, in case this part of Ypres history is lost. I kind of wish as if the In Flanders Fields Museum might acquire one or two of these graves, because they are part of the history of the Great War. And I'll put a few photographs of them on the podcast website. I can hear the bells of one of the church sounding in the distance. One of the things I like about staying in Ypres are the churches. I'm in the Novotel, very close to St Jack's Church. It's nice to hear the bells in the morning. The bells always seem to me to be a sound of the old world somehow. Another world. The world in which these men marched to war, fought through here, returned, some of them, to remember their comrades in cemeteries like this, in the streets of cities like Ypres. And I'm coming into that most definite old part of the cemetery now. I can see quite large graves with huge impact marks of shells on them, huge chunks of these graves torn out. And I certainly hope these might stay. I'm going to take a photograph of one now so we can see that. It's a very impressive one. I bumped into a Belgian photographer today who came up to say hello, and he was running a little course in Tyncott Cemetery about photography and about the history there. I think that's part of War Graves Week, maybe, because that's what it is this week. And I said to him, we were talking about photography, I said, I've been to this cemetery, I don't know how many times, Tyncott. And every time I come, I take photographs. The light is different, the angle's different, the clouds are different, and you see something different. And I think the lens of a camera phone, is a good way to kind of interpret the battlefields as you visit them. There's a little blackbird been following me around in here, and he's now on a headstone just up ahead of me. And I've come round to one of the favourite, if that's the right word for it, graves in this part of the cemetery. Not a war grave, it's a huge crypt, a vault with steps going up into it. It's damaged, the roof is off, the glass is gone. There's shrapnel marks on the outside of the structure. There's shrapnel marks on the inside of the structure. And every time I stop here, I think of soldiers who were coming to and fro from the centre of Ypres up to the front line, and from the front line area back to Ypres. Soldiers were given instructions, particularly if they were in units like the artillery or the Army Service Corps, or if they were Royal Engineer Dispatch Riders, or if they were runners. They would act independently, a lot of soldiers. They weren't marching to and from with the entire battalion. And men would come down that Menin Road and make their way through areas. And I like to think of soldiers coming into the cemetery here and seeing this. It would have afforded them a little bit of shelter, and I can imagine soldiers going up those steps and sitting in there and having a quick fag before an officer noticed it, and giving themselves a 5-minute break in between whatever their duty was from the front line to whatever their duty was in Ypres. This was a little point where they could come in a little nook and cranny in this cemetery, have a fag, have a bit of a slug of water from their water bottle, and an NCO or an officer isn't watching them. And I like to think of soldiers sitting in there doing that. How many British Tommies, how many soldiers from all over Britain and the wider empire passed through here, sat on those steps, stood in that crypt, sheltered not just from the elements, not just to have a break, perhaps from bombardments along the Menin Road. Very evocative place, and I would hate to see this disappear. And again, I'll put a picture of that on the website. And as I move away from these much older graves into this next bit of the British military plots, it takes me up to quite an important grave in this cemetery. It's not a war grave, it's not an old grave, although it is from a much earlier period than today, but it's a grave connected to the history of remembrance here in Flanders, here in Ypres, and it's the grave of Pierre van den Brandbusche, who was the chief of police of the city of Ypres, and he was born in 1875, I think that says on the grave. So he was a veteran of the Great War. He died at Ypres in 1936, and he was one of those who was part of the Last Post Committee, a founder of the Last Post Committee, one who drove the last post coming into being. He's partly one of those responsible for it. A very important figure in that act of remembrance, which I remind my groups every time I come here, is not a ceremony organised by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission or the Royal British Legion or any British organisation. It is a Belgian ceremony, a mark of respect for the sacrifice of that 250,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers here during the 4 years of the Great War. And we owe so much to this man, because many of us have attended that ceremony. I have several of the nights that I've been here this week. I've stood there and listened to the last post, and I have no idea how many times that I have heard it. Probably far more than he did. If he died in 36, he had, 8 years of it. I've been coming here now for 41 years, and I've lost track of how many times I've heard it, but every single time it's the same. It's an intense feeling, a connection to the Great War. Its notes echo under the gate, across the moat, out onto the battlefields, and somehow call to the dead and call to those who marched through that gate and returned but are no more. That generation has left us now, of course. But that act of remembrance, which means so much to so many of us, began with people like Pierre van den Brandbusche. We owe him a lot. And I always like to pause and think of him. This is certainly one grave that should never, ever disappear from this cemetery. So I'm going to walk now up to the final bit of the cemetery, where there's another handful of British graves, almost all of them from the early period of the war, and we'll have a look at those. So I've come into that stretch of wall on the edge of the cemetery where there is a British plot, and this particular row of graves, there's a lot of cavalrymen here. So there's a Second Lieutenant Boozy in the 4th Dragoon Guards, Major Gwyn Griffiths of the 32nd Lancers of the Indian Army, who was the Brigade Major of the 9th Cavalry Brigade. He died of his wounds here on the 24th of May 1915, aged 40, and his unit was up on the front line defending the ground around the Frasenberg Ridge at that time. Key moment towards the end of the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. And then as I walk into the next plot, there are some men from Lancer regiments, 5th Lancers and the 16th Lancers. And one of the 16th Lancers is Major Arundel Neve, who died on the 21st of February 1915, a relation of Airy Neve. And these men were all killed when their war had gone so very differently to what they'd imagined. Lancer regiments, Dragoon Guards at the far end there. They'd gone to war on horseback, thinking that this was going to be a war of movement, of dashing dare, of sabres blazing in the sun, of lances with pennants on the end charging the enemy. And now here they were in February 1915, dismounted from their horses and in the front line, in a front-line trench. But of course, for cavalry, British cavalry, in the years between the Boer War and the First World War, this is exactly what their purpose was. We'd moved away, Britain's army, they'd moved away from the idea of cavalry just being cavalry. The Boer War had taught them that, with mounted infantry, and the Boer commandos and their mounted infantry getting the upper hand on us. So British soldiers, British cavalrymen, in that period before the Great War were trained as cavalry, lancers, or in sabre troops and dragoon guards. but they're also trained as infantry soldiers. They carried a Lee Enfield rifle, not a cavalry carbine, a proper rifle in a big leather bucket on their saddle. So the rifle could be pulled out, the soldier dismount and fight as infantry. And now here in this static war that the Great War had become, this is what they were doing. A hard acceptance, I would guess, from career cavalry officers whose idea was fighting a war on horseback. But this was the reality of their task and much of the reality of their war for their comrades who lived beyond them until the war went mobile again and cavalry came back into its own. It's often decried as a useless arm of the service, perhaps, these crazy cavalry attacks, and there were. At Monchy-le-Preux in 1917 is a good example of that. But in the last phase of the war, when the war went truly mobile again, cavalry were the reconnaissance troops of the day. They could move forward, they could gather information, seek out the enemy. And that's exactly what they were doing right up to the very end. George Ellison from Leeds, 5th Lancers. There's one of his officers, Lieutenant Coulter, here. I wonder if he knew him. He was killed, George Ellison, killed on horseback on the outskirts of Mons in the last moments of the war. For him, the war had gone full circle. He'd gone to war on horseback in 1914, served in the retreat from Mons, killed at the very end at Mons on horseback as his patrol bumped a German section with a machine gun in a village near Mons. And we've gone slightly curveball there, but that's what comes out of wandering around cemeteries like this, reflecting on the graves, thinking about their meaning and the wider stories that they tell us. And I'm just walking over to the last row of graves now. There's a fantastic book that was published during the war called The Bond of Sacrifice. And I'm very lucky to have an original copy of it. It's been reprinted, and I think there's a digital version of it as well. And it's got biographies and photographs of regular officers, territorial officers, but officers that were killed in the 1914 campaign. My copy comes from an old friend, Jack, who very kindly left it to me in his will because he knew how much I loved it. And I was always fascinated with the officers that were killed in the first few months of the war, visited many of their graves and matched them up with the photographs and the biographies in that book. And it's something you can do. It's a fascinating insight into officers of the British Army and that part of British society, the upper part of British society, the aristocracy, men of wealth, men of title, men of privilege. And they're reflected in graves like this. And here I am now standing at Captain the Honourable Annesley. So we've got an honourable, and we've got men from very well appointed and wealthy families in here. And it's getting windy now, which I hope isn't reflected too much in the recording. But there is, and that's the one I was looking for, there is a grave. He's tucked up against the hedge in here. Now we talked, about the grave of Prince Maurice, how they wanted to repatriate it, and it's a normal headstone instead of a big monument. And there is an example of an original wartime grave marker in here at the back of the Commonwealth headstone of Captain Shedden of the Royal Garrison Artillery, who died on the 31st of October 1914. It's a grey stone cross, possibly from the kind of stone that's used in the cemetery or in the wider Ypres area, possibly commissioned specially by his fellow officers and men. And it's the original marker that stood on his grave. And this is, of course, exactly what would have happened if it was left to the families. There would be monuments like this on graves of officers with money, families with money, and the humble gunners and privates and sappers who were buried around them, their families would struggle to pay for a wooden cross. So it was one of the best decisions ever made, I think, with the creation of the silent cities and the commemoration of the dead, to have what Kipling referred to as the tablet, the headstone, to immortalise these men, immortalise the dead of that generation. So many stories, we could spend the rest of the podcast telling them all, but then we'd have nothing to find another day, and there's always something else to find. So a little Ypres walk this time from the Menin Gates, thinking about what's happening there now, the positivity of renovations, a new monument emerging, a refreshed monument, and its safety, its existence guaranteed for future generations, which is incredibly important. And I've come to the far side of the cemetery here now in the Ypres Town Cemetery, having wandered through all those graves and seen echoes of the past, the marks on the civil graves of a walk through that part of the cemetery, and coming out the big brown gates back on to the Menin Road. It's not a portal from the old world to the new, but it kind of is. The old world behind me in the cemetery and the new world. The population of Ypres going about their business on a Sunday evening. The cars passing me on the road, perhaps going to a family dinner for a drink in Ypres. Some may be walking around the corner to attend the last post. But I've come on to what was a conduit to the Great War more than a century ago. This is the Menin Road, and the men whose graves I've just walked by and whose names I walked underneath on the Menin Gate, this was their route to the forward zone of the battlefield, and today takes us along that same route to the old front line.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.